Testing. All right, we're going to get rolling. Folks that are stocking up at lunch, feel free to keep doing so, but otherwise we're gonna kick off. Also, just a note for all of us, we're recording this on Zoom, so we'll have a record of the event. But yeah, let's get going. I'm Tom Wolf. I'm Director of Democracy Initiatives at the Brennan Center for Justice, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this lunch talk with the famed author Ross Perlin. Ross, who's sitting here to my right, is a linguist, a writer, and a translator. He's the author of Language City, the fight to preserve endangered mother languages in New York. And he's the co-director of the nonprofit Endangered Language Alliance, where he oversees work on language documentation, mapping, and policy. He teaches linguistics at Columbia University, and he's also an expert in Himalayan languages and a translator, primarily from Chinese to English. So these achievements that I just listed off there represent more than 20 years of hard work and deep immersion in language on Ross's part. And this is work that's taken him all over the world. But he's also a New Yorker at heart, and he's someone who's deeply invested in the city and all the people who live here. One way of looking at his work, I think, is as an intellectual enterprise, but another way of looking at it is just a tremendous act of community building and a commitment to creating a city that's more inclusive and more just. I've had the joy of seeing all of this work come together over the last 2 decades, and I'm very excited to share it with my coworkers here today. I hope that I've persuaded you that Ross is the more interesting person that's sitting up here, so I'm going to turn it over to him. Just 2 quick notes. Because we're recording on Zoom and we'd like to have a record of what's going on here, when we hit the question and answer session, please step to the mic over here and click it on. That way everyone who's listening can hear you. And the other is the book that you're about to hear about in the occasion for today, Language City, is sitting in piles over there, and they are free for the taking. So hopefully everyone will grab a copy on the way out. I can assure you that whatever we talk about here will only make you more excited to crack into this book, which has been a really fantastic read. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Ross. I was hoping you could provide us a little bit more background on Language City and ELA for people who may be unfamiliar with your work.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you to Mellon and to everyone here at the Brennan Center for having me. Thank you guys for taking some of your lunchtime to listen to a linguist. I don't think linguists and lawyers talk enough, so I'm excited for this opportunity. And there actually are these worlds of language policy and language justice, which are closely tied up with our work at the Endangered Language Alliance and are part of this book, Language City, which I'm going to be talking about, which came out just a few months ago. So I'm really excited for this kind of convergence and conversation. We're sitting right now in the most linguistically diverse city, not just in the world, but in the history of the world, with over 700 languages and counting spoken here. And that's out of some 7,000 plus languages in the world. I think many people don't realize that the world is that deeply linguistically diverse. Of course, there are only about 200 nation states. So how did these 7,000 plus languages fit into these 200 nation states? And the languages represent, excuse me, a much deeper form of history, I would argue, much deeper local identities than the nation states, which for the most part have borders that were really drawn in just the last 100 or a few hundred years as a result of colonialism and the rise of nation states worldwide. But there's a paradox here. New York and other cities like it, for New York is not alone, it might be the most extraordinary case, but we could look at London, we could look at Paris, we could also look at Johannesburg and Jakarta and many much smaller cities as well. But the paradox is that the languages are coming here, but the languages are also increasingly endangered because as many as half of those 7,000 languages in the world are in danger of disappearing over the next decade, next century or so. And this is something that linguists have only just been awakening to. Language activists have been, in their individual communities, been much more focused on this. And this is, we could talk about the causes of language endangerment, but this is a global situation that's happening everywhere. And just as much here in the US, beginning with Native American languages, beginning with one of the languages that I spend time profiling in the book, Lenape, the original language of this place, down to a single native speaker at this point, who's in her 80s, who's in Canada. although there's a courageous band of revivalists, younger Lenape people who are reviving it as a second language, and I profile one of them in the book, who taught the language at our center, which is near Union Square. For the first time, it's been taught on this land in the last several centuries. But language endangerment is now a pervasive fact of the world. It's obviously the spread of larger, what have sometimes been called killer languages, whether that's English or Spanish or Mandarin or others, that are spreading for all sorts of political, economic, social, and other reasons. And obviously these forces have been playing out for centuries, but are now coming to a head in many ways. And it's not just about the number of speakers, it's actually about the sort of breakdown in intergenerational transmission. So this is the sort of global background of what's happening with linguistic diversity worldwide. And endangered languages are also those that are least likely to have been documented, for which there really are, generally, these are primarily oral languages. For most of history, most languages have been primarily oral. And there are, in most cases, no books, no dictionaries, no materials in most of these languages as well. So this is the work that we do at the Endangered Language Alliance. But we do it from an urban perspective. We do it here in New York because now you have speakers of languages from all over the world coming here. So it's an immigration story, which we'll talk about as well. But we do at the Endangered Language Alliance a huge variety of programs, beginning with this kind of primary language documentation, creating dictionaries, creating grammars, working with speakers to record stories, conversations, and so on in their languages, as well as different kinds of activities to revive the languages and to see that they kind of can continue to be used, which is a huge uphill battle. Everything from classes to new technological tools and so on. So this book, Language City, is kind of on the one hand, it's about the past, present, and future of the world's most linguistically diverse city. How did we get this way? How did this happen in this particular place? But it's also about languages and cities more broadly and the increasing urban linguistic diversity that's everywhere. And then it also features profiles of 6 different speakers who we've been working with for years, speaking different languages from all over the world. I'll kind of briefly describe them maybe. And they represent completely different language families, completely unrelated languages, as well as the sort of different kinds of challenges that language activists face in their pursuit of language revitalization and language justice. So one of the languages is Lenape, as I mentioned. And Karen, who is profiled in the book, passed away while the book was just coming out, but would drive 10 hours from Ontario, where, as I said, the last speaker of Lenape is, who's been kind of leading this revival, to teach the language here, to sort of bring it back. Another profile in the book is a language called Seke. This gives an example of a highly endangered language where as many as 1/3 of the speakers are here in a single building or a couple of buildings in Brooklyn. The language is originally from 5 villages of Nepal. Seke is the name of the language. And it's an example of one of these transnational communities that is split literally between villages on the other side of the world and a vertical village essentially here in Brooklyn. Another language, Wahi, that's profiled from Tajikistan. Husnia is the speaker who we've been working with for years. So the book also kind of moves between New York and the home regions of the speakers as well. So to give a sense of how New York and other cities are deeply linked to very particular places by particular transnational ties and migration routes that may be on the other side of the world, and what the implications of that are culturally, economically, politically. Nahuatl, which is the most widely spoken indigenous language of Mexico. I profile Irwin, who is a chef here in New York, who is sort of cooking with Nahuatl etymologies in his food. This is, was the language of the Aztecs. This is a language that underlies so much of Mexican identity, and words like chili and chocolate and tomato and avocado and many others ultimately come from Nahuatl, and in Irwin represents part of the massive indigenous Latin American presence, which has come to New York and other cities in recent decades, speaking a wide variety of languages. Yiddish, which is a language which has had a very important role in the history of New York. And now in some sense in Hasidic Brooklyn is kind of going into the 5th generation, which is very rare for any kind of immigrant language to sort of survive beyond 3 generations in an urban context. So a case of a language becoming sort of unendangered in the middle of a city. And then finally, a writing system, really, rather than a language, called Unko from West Africa, which is used to write what are called the Manding languages, which is really a language family spoken across a wide section of West Africa. And I profile Ibrahima, who is the first person to sort of bring this relatively new writing system. West Africa has been a hotbed of new writing systems in the 20th century. Unko is perhaps the most successful, a completely new writing system that is, also being brought into Unicode and into new technologies. And so Ibrahima's story is sort of about how writing and technology play into this. And then finally, the book kind of gets into what is the future of linguistic diversity, given language endangerment, given the threats to immigration, what will happen to the world's most linguistically diverse city. And I think that gets into a lot of questions of policy and, language justice.
And, these profiles that Ross is speaking about in his book are points where I think his analysis becomes particularly humane. He's talking about some pretty complicated concepts, but he embodies them in specific people. And I think you really get to know these people very well. It has an interesting effect on your understanding of New York City, I think, after you're done with this book. The book very much in the process of talking about these linguistic concepts also places these specific people at the center of a New York narrative. These are people who are, in many cases, living in the outer bounds of the city. They are representative of communities who are often geographically marginalized, but also kind of marginalized in the public imagination about what New York City is. If you listen to AM or FM radio coming out of New York, if you listen to music coming out of New York, if you read any of the many books written about the city that you can kind of scoop off the tables in the local bookstores around the city, these stories are not told. There is a kind of like radical orientation of what's central to the city. I think after you pass through this book, this kind of enriching of a point of kind of cultural or kind of political poverty in our imagination, I think isn't the only sense in which the communities that Ross is talking about are lacking in representation. Another way that we're experiencing representation deficits is in the data that's used to represent the communities that live in the city. And this is a place where I think there's a lot of overlap between what Ross is talking about and what he does and his organization does and the work we do here. So I was wondering, Ross, if you could talk a little bit more about the efforts you and others have been making to make sure our data is more representative, how you've been working with the city and the state and some of the other things that we work with.
So one of the things that underlies the book is a long-term language mapping project, which we've been doing, and that you can see the results of at languagemap.nyc, where over 700 languages are mapped to over 1,200 different sites, with stories, with recordings in many cases of the communities. This is a project we've been doing for years at the Endangered Language Alliance to bring visibility and audibility to these languages. We have been going as an organization, the Endangered Language Alliance, since 2010. And we quickly realized that most of the communities and speakers we were working with were not showing up in any official data set, that these languages, and we can talk about what language data looks like. It's very, very poor in this country, really relies on one question on the census, which is deeply inadequate, ultimately tied to the Voting Rights Act is basically why the Census Bureau kind of collects this data, but the way they do it, and then of course all the issues with who ends up kind of what languages the census is administered in, how the census administers it, how the question is asked, really focused more on English proficiency rather than actually linguistic diversity. But essentially you have kind of data on really fewer than 100 languages. And then the way that it's tabulated as well by the Census Bureau. In theory, there has been in the past some kind of consultation with linguists, or look at how linguists talk about languages, because what's a language, what's a dialect, how do we even talk about language names? There's a lot of complexities that are not kind of cut and dried, where linguistic thinking may evolve, but the Census Bureau is sort of not there. And different countries collect this data very differently. For comparison, the Canadian census, because in Canada, language is such a central issue, especially the sort of Francophone, Anglophone divide, but also, First Nations languages. There's a range of questions and quite sophisticated, discussion of on the census and then in the way the data is used in terms of the actual living multilingualism of people's lives. Multilingualism itself is not really registered by the census. Extra data is essentially thrown out if you list multiple languages. Most New Yorkers, and again, New York is just a sort of paradigm case, but actually we could talk about the whole country. Most New Yorkers are multilingual. Many are highly multilingual. The 6 speakers who I profile in the book speak between them over 30 different languages. Half of all New Yorkers speak a language other than English at home. Spanish, in all of its varieties from all over the world, is of course, very much the second language of New York and of the country. But then there are, just in New York alone, there are something like 10 languages with over 100,000 speakers. And I spent some time talking about those situations, but then there's also this incredibly kind of long tail of languages as well, some of which may have just a few speakers, and many of which, as I said, are oral. So our mapping work has basically found over 5 times the number of languages that the census data records from the one question on the ACS. And even the data that they do have is really, I would argue, only useful for the top few dozen languages. And we do at languagemap.nyc, which is that our site, we have both our data and the latest census data for comparison's sake, but also to show the major shortcomings in the way that data is collected. So essentially we set out to do a kind of linguistic census, working through thousands of conversations with, community leaders, with language activists, with this whole network of people here in New York. The first time that a city's linguistic diversity had actually been sort of mapped and made visible. And of course, there were all kinds of choices there, and we couldn't sort of, simulate the resources of the Census Bureau itself. But this work, then has led to various policymakers contacting us. We've since worked, and we can talk about sort of language policy and where that lives or doesn't live in the US. But the most exciting stuff really that we see is happening at the city level, and nowhere so more than New York. So we've worked for years now in different capacities with the Department of Health, Department of Education, and MOIA, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs in particular, who've been really interested in using the map as a tool to understand the true linguistic diversity of New York and the language access needs of the different communities.
And this work has also become part of the public arts in the city too, right?
It's also something that a lot of artists have been really interested in kind of in looking at. And I mean, it's also the range of artistic traditions in communities themselves, artistic and musical traditions. We're organizing a week-long series of performances at Little Island, if you guys know that island park that is in the Hudson now, where we're going to be featuring, singers and poets and who create in these languages as well. So it's also a major part of our cultural infrastructure. And we talk about needing a linguistic infrastructure for cities like New York. And again, I think New York is a paradigm case, but it's by no means alone. And you actually have in many smaller cities and suburbs today as well, with the diversification of the entire country, with over 20% of Americans speaking a language other than English at home, even according to census data, which again is going to be an underestimate. It's I think these are all steps towards a much deeper engagement with the true multilingualism of the people of this country.
And you touched on this briefly as we were talking, but one of the things that we say in our census work here and motivates that work that we do is this notion that the census is critical to earning political representation for communities. And the reason for that is because the census data is what's used in part to draw the districts that states use for all sorts of different kinds of elections. So if your community isn't represented in those numbers, you're effectively politically invisible. But it's also related to other efforts that are required under the Voting Rights Act in terms of language access. And I was wondering if you could just maybe pull on that thread a little bit more. Some of my colleagues work on this, but I know a lot of folks in this room that might be a little bit of news to them.
Yeah, and I'm curious to learn from you guys when we kind of go to questions about this, because as I said, the Voting Rights Act is really the fulcrum for why the Census Bureau collects what information it does collect, how they collect it and present it. Although there has been a language question on the US Census since 1890, and that date is interesting. It reflects obviously concerns about immigration, the sort of heyday of Ellis Island, the city that was, and the country that was being made at that time. But the question has changed in different ways over time, and in its kind of most recent incarnation on the American Community Survey in recent decades, in recent years, it's really been geared around language access for people going to the ballot. And we see all kinds of different sort of pain points that people are facing in terms of language access and information. I mean, during the height of COVID as well, here in New York, multilingual immigrant neighborhoods in places like Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx, which are in the focus of my book and the focus of the work we do, were the hardest hit. The essential workers. It was also an informational and linguistic crisis as well, as so many recent crises have been. So, courts, hospitals, the education system, these are all, major sort of pain points where communication is at the foundation of democracy and of service provision. And, there's a reason why in a phone tree, it's like the very first question is, press 1 for English, press 2 for Spanish, and so on. Not to say that those phone trees are adequate by any means, but the point is just that the very first thing is language, how to communicate. And, there's many levels to that too. It's not something that you can just kind of easily plug into. So the ballot is, one of these essential places. And, I think at least it's been recognized to the degree where, as I understand it, since about 1975, as a kind of extension of the Voting Rights Act, there has been a sort of requirement with a very tortured formula that itself then relies on the census data, which, as I said, is deeply inadequate to dictate when there must be multilingual ballots. And I've looked at that, that list of what languages, that when that is updated, and it's half a dozen languages in New York City, right, out of the 700 plus. And it has a very specific provisions where, languages of the Caribbean, for instance, or, Arabic, for instance, I mean, cannot be included in that particular formula, because it just mentions really particular groups under very particular circumstances, and then this very kind of narrow formula. Of course, many localities then do kind of voluntarily translate the ballot into other languages, but and then you might think this is not really just about the ballot as well. It's about the whole kind of apparatus of democracy, all of the information, all of the things that we take for granted, and the sort of the materials that go into it. So, I think that there's just a massive amount that is taken for granted, just the way that speakers of larger languages like English take for granted that there's always going to be a dictionary for their, or that there's always going to be software in their language, or that, don't really understand the ways in which what are called often like low resource languages, and in some cases radically low resource languages where there's no information at all, what that's actually like.
Now, your book doesn't just center, specific people or even New York City. It does go beyond the bounds of the city, following people on their journeys and also your journeys after language, trips that you've been taking over the last 10 to 20 years. There's a moment in the book that I remember that I thought was funny, but also kind of profound in a way, where I think you were visiting Nepal and you found a bootleg copy of ELA work in a market up there, then very much a sense of the world being both kind of like ginormous and also very small in weird and surprising ways. But when we're talking about sort of where one needs to go to understand what's going on with language in the city, I think it really points up the extent to which when we're talking about language and linguistic diversity, we're also talking about immigration, right?
And actually, the election posters that I've been seeing most in my neighborhood in Queens recently, I think are for an upcoming Ecuadorian election. So, you know, there's also a tremendous amount of voting and democratic activity that's happening in the city, you know, connecting many different countries and populations.
I'll actually cut in there just briefly to say one of the more interesting things about walking around the city with Ross is that you can step into sort of any store and he like can immediately x-ray it to figure out what languages are active in that space. And so you'll see, oh, actually there's, you know, 3 different local newspapers here and they're in 3 different languages, or look what's hanging on the wall, or I just heard a snippet of conversation going on in the back and I'd never heard that before in that language. So yeah, there is this way in which, you know, once you plug into this framework, it really starts to enliven your sense of what's going on around you.
I hope that the book will kind of will help do this, because this is part of our our goal at the Endangered Language Alliance, and kind of a way of seeing the city and being in the city that, you know, even just this sort of signage and media and so on is really just a first layer, because again, most of the languages of the city are primarily oral. And of course, if you don't know the language, it's just, right, this just sounds like a foreign language. But the argument is that actually these, you know, the sort of long tail of the city's languages, hundreds and hundreds of actual mother tongues, which in some cases are spoken primarily, you know, in people's homes or in the sort of hometown associations and clubs that people have for people from their home region who are here, that these are integral to the city's history, that they've always been integral to the city's history ever since it went from being this Lenape-speaking archipelago to then this Dutch West India Company kind of entrepot port, which itself was already different in many ways from the other 12 colonies, because, you know, it wasn't even sort of and this is the sort of historical part, but even in its very first years, Dutch New Amsterdam actually had a reported 18 languages spoken by the first several hundred inhabitants, because it was really just this kind of place that was drawing on. It was at the intersection of 3 continents. It was, you know, there were Native American languages even besides Lenape here. There were the languages brought by enslaved Africans. And then there were as well the languages of a whole kind of motley mix of different European peoples who were employed by or connected with the Dutch West India Company. And that, for the 400-year history of the city, has just kind of increased. You know, immigration has been integral to the city's history, as it has been to the country's history. And I argued that the archetypal New Yorker is an immigrant. We have something close to 40% of all New Yorkers being born in another country. And the world that, you know, the world of New York today, that the book reflects, is in many ways the world that 1965 made, the 1965 Immigration Act, which, for all of its flaws, kind of reopened, and then sort of more than ever, the door to immigrate into the U.S. after it had been slammed shut, essentially, in 1924 with essentially racist immigration quotas that really only permitted people from certain Northern and Western European countries to come here as part of an attempt, with all kinds of, you know, pseudoscientific, racist kind of stuff, an attempt to freeze the ethnic balance of the country during what was really the last major kind of anti-immigrant backlash, which was happening in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in many ways, I think one of the questions is now whether 2024 is going to be the new 1924, and whether the country will again have its, you know, the doors will be slammed shut. And what are the implications for that, you know, for us as a country, for us as a city as well. But we live in the world that 1965 made, I argue, and it made the city and thus the country more deeply diverse than ever before. And I think language is a lens onto that, which really goes much deeper into where people are actually coming from, the cultures that are actually involved, the particular hometown ties, the true sister cities, essentially, that so many New Yorkers have on the other side of the world. It's important to understand that, people are not just coming from Mexico or Nepal as kind of, sort of nation state headings, but that something like, excuse me, 3/4 of Mexican New Yorkers in a very particular pattern are coming from southern Mexico, from places like Puebla and Guerrero, which are more heavily indigenous than other parts of Mexico, which is why you then have tens of thousands of people who speak languages like Nahuatl and Mixteco, which are indigenous Mexican languages, which are to some extent entire kind of language families. There is such sort of deep diversity in some cases from town to town that linguists are trying to work with speakers to understand. And then, what does it mean then that, the vast majority of deliveristas, delivery workers in New York, who are now essential to our whole kind of food economy, and also in some ways one of the most exploited classes of workers in the city, are heavily speakers of those languages and of Mayan languages from Guatemala. And so if you're going to sort of, understand even just that dynamic or the dynamics of the labor market or the economy in a city like New York or others, you really need to go into the languages.
And this also created a dynamic that you've mentioned to me before when we're talking about kind of voting and election stuff, of the importance of things like know your rights guides that are either in people's languages or coming from trusted messengers. Can you talk a little bit more about that kind of element of the work?
So this is a lot of the work that we've turned to at the Endangered Language Alliance, because this is what speakers want to be doing. Even when we started in many ways, with a focus on kind of like basic linguistic research, because in so many cases, those basic resources are not there. We've turned increasingly, and with COVID and with the threats to immigration and with a variety of issues, including work with the city in the sort of get out the count census effort in 2020, which we were part of, we've turned to making messages, translating materials, PSAs, and doing audio video stuff primarily, because we're talking about oral languages, recognizing and working with the knowledge of the diversity of languages that people are speaking and the particular varieties that are most likely to be known or spoken here. And then, sort of all the questions that are involved in that, the translation of terminology, right? There's just, in the coronavirus alone, the number of terms to sort of translate or work through or think about, and how these things should be explained and broken down. And, likewise with voting rights as well, there's a whole bunch of terminology that we may take for granted that in some cases, there's not a dictionary to just sort of look up, how do you say ballot? It's actually about coining the term, working with speakers to come up perhaps for the first time ever, a term that will make sense. And of course, perhaps it can be borrowed from, Spanish or English or something like that, but that also has its issues as well. It needs to be explained in some way. And so the translational, terminological work, but then also the trusted messenger, which of course, is so essential to outreach among, across a variety of domains, but really I think has an even deeper importance when it comes to relatively smaller communities where there is a history of, there are reasons to mistrust communications that might be coming from government or official sources, from majority language speakers, and where it's, very clear that, an outsider will not speak the language. So it has to be somebody who is in some sense a linguistic insider. And so, what does that mean, and what does outreach look like? I think it has a whole different thrust, and there's a whole different set of tools and considerations. It's not about just like, let's run this flyer through ChatGPT and, or Google Translate, although the latest instance of Google Translate just released a couple of days ago now includes languages like Nahuatl, and they're trying to sort of expand the number of minority and indigenous languages that they offer. It's still a tiny number, and I would say in general, you have to imagine that actually only about 5% of the world's languages are meaningfully online and in digital spaces. And, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Wikipedia or Google, the most kind of wide multilingual tools that are there, are still just Wikipedia. It's 300 something languages. Google Translate, it's now up to, a couple hundred. But for the vast majority of languages, they're not they're not there. And it's because even that sort of, again, they're being primarily oral languages, even the basic kind of research or legibility is not there. And then speakers and communities have different sort of views on what it means to work with that, and how much it should be, these technologies should be embraced. So it has all kinds of implications, I think, for multilingual outreach and, the vote.
Our colleagues here at the center working on the Brennan en Español project encountered versions of what you're talking about. The nut that was very hard to crack was how to actually say partisan gerrymandering. What does that term mean? So yeah, we're grappling with these same kinds of things and attempting to participate in these same kinds of dynamics through that kind of work that we do through our voting work and census work, to, if not equip people directly with the languages they're speaking, at the very least to be able to provide them information that can be given to their trusted messengers, that can then be translated into language that will be most understandable and most persuasive to the people that those messengers work with. That's really the whole model, not just of like the work we were doing this past decade on census confidentiality protection, but the way the Census Bureau itself works. They have a whole system that's oriented towards recruiting thousands of what they call community partners or trusted messengers to do precisely what Ross is talking about. We want to leave a little bit of time for question and answer. So I was wondering if we could kind of dip into two other things we haven't touched on but have come up, Ross, as you've been talking. One is just kind of generally, what is language policy? I feel like that's something that we don't really have in the United States, and it's sort of like I'm a little foggy on what that means. And then also, what do it mean to think about language policy in a way that's aligned with concepts of justice or language justice?
Language policy is a subfield of linguistics. I teach it. It is something that linguists kind of work on or involved in. But as you say, it barely exists in the United States in a kind of actual kind of acknowledged way. Of course, there's all kinds of implicit forms or de facto forms of language policy that happen. And some talk about language policy even in the context of, an event like this. Essentially, the policy is everything's happening in English, right? Or language policy in a home where, parents might say, you're going to be raised bilingually to their kids, and one parent is going to speak this, one is going to speak that. There can be policy at all these different levels. But in terms of, classic language policy inscribed in the law, indeed, it's really a kind of beyond gray area here in the US. It's, we have no official language. There is no official language that is actually inscribed in the Constitution or anywhere else. Obviously, English has acted, and there have been debates and discussions about this. And there is now, there has been a growing kind of English only or English first movement, which has been spreading, especially through sort of certain red states and certain sectors of the Republican Party since really the 1990s, again, with a clear intention, clearly as part of an anti-immigrant and especially kind of anti-Spanish agenda. And so now there are a number of states, I forget the exact count, but as many as half of all states now, I think, have some kind of thing trying to inscribe at the state level that English is the official language. But many states don't have that. And again, there's nothing like that at the federal level. As I said, some of the most interesting work happens at the city level. And in New York, again, there's no official language, of course, but there are 10 so-called citywide languages. And this is actually pretty extraordinary and something that has just evolved through the mayoral initiative in the last kind of 20 or so years. And again, it kind of is tied to both census data and some data that the City Department of Education collects. But basically, the 10 largest languages are supposed to be supported to some degree by the city with kind of more in-house translation. And that includes, some of the large languages we've mentioned, but also Bengali and Haitian Creole and Russian. And some of the languages that are particularly spoken here with populations, speaker populations of something like over 100,000 people in each case. Then there are other aspects to language policy as well at the city and now increasingly at the state level. So at the state level, a number of states are adopting language access laws. So New York State has beefed up its law. New Jersey, I think, has just adopted something. Illinois has something in the works. And it's typically not just about sort of mandating certain languages, which again can be subject to periodic review based on new data, if the data is any good, but also things like mandating that agencies have language access policies, that they have language access coordinators, that they have that there are plans, that people are thinking about this stuff. And of course, it gets very complicated and life or death in hospitals and in courts. And the actual details of implementation. I mean, we've had the Department of Homeland Security has been reaching out to us and others about language, issues at the border, where among many of the most commonly encountered languages are indigenous Latin American languages, and now languages from all over the world. But they're sort of grappling even just to understand what people are speaking and to get sort of to really get people to say what their mother tongues are as well. So language policy is kind of, I would say it's a growing field in the US. There are other countries we can look to where there are much more sort of sophisticated and interesting sets of experiences. I mentioned Canada, but we could as well look to, the different situations in places like India and South Africa, where large numbers of languages are in theory supported in different ways. Language justice, I think, is the next kind of thrust that is coming and is increasingly an important topic of conversation in these kinds of circles, where it's not just about language policy to sort of ensure that basic information gets through to people, but actually that looks more holistically at what linguistic diversity is, the benefits it has for society, the historic marginalization of speakers of minority and indigenous languages, and sees that actually there is a duty that governments have, that larger language communities have to support and aid and recognize, at the very least, to stop sort of stomping on smaller languages. So this pursuit of language justice, I think, is kind of in its early days, and it's obviously exploring intersections as well with social and racial and economic and political forms of justice. But I think language needs to be part of the conversation because it's so deeply woven into all of these issues.
So I hope that this actually raises more questions than it answers. If folks have any questions, we've got some time. The mic's here. Just make sure you step up to the mic. Ghislaine. Yeah.
So you mentioned that a lot of communities who where immigration happened generations ago, the language was not generation. Can you talk a little bit about Can you talk a little bit about what is lost when a language is lost or in the process of being lost? And then relatedly, what have you seen, what does it take to revive a language, to keep a language going? You were talking about young folks learning Lenape, what sort of motivates that to happen? Because I try to speak Punjabi, but I just don't see that in peers from whose parents have immigrated from Punjab. And so it's something that I think about very often because I feel like a lot is being lost, but it'd be nice to know what patterns you see in the work that you do.
What is lost when a language is lost? It's massive, and you can see it at the individual level. You can see it at the at a wider social level, but it's in terms of, we can just speaking more broadly in terms of the knowledge that is encoded in every single language, which is knowledge of a place or of places, the places where that language is from, and the sort of the knowledge that is built into it, the knowledge of botanical and biological diversity that the language is connected to, the language of the history of the people and the stories of the people and the intricate social and economic relations that are encoded in the language, the entire, in many ways, historical experience of the people. And again, of course, we could talk about language mixing and multiple languages, but very little really gets translated over. The oral literature, the storytelling, the music, all of that knowledge, which exists in every single language, not to mention the sort of linguistic complexity and the scientific importance of understanding, every single language in the world has very, distinct and unique characteristics and is equally sophisticated from a linguistic point of view. There's no sense in which some languages are higher than others and others are broken. Every language spoken natively is completely equipped to do all of the communicative work that its speakers have needed it to do. And it's actually, in many cases, the least known languages which have the most to teach us about human communication in general. So, there's a massive amount in terms of kind of the scientific, artistic, historical knowledge. And then at the level of the individual, the benefits of bilingualism and multilingualism, especially for the young growing mind, is something that is, more and more research has now kind of made unshakably clear. Whereas, in some cases, people were thinking not too long ago that actually, don't confuse a child with multiple languages, like they should just speak one language, but actually the benefits in terms of cognitive flexibility and empathy and various other things have now been linked to bilingualism and multilingualism. And then you might think also in terms of, the story of immigration as well. I mean, the links to a history, the links to another part of the world, the sort of linguistic knowledge and resources and expertise that people are bringing to this city and this country or wherever they migrate to are extraordinary and precious gifts which should be cultivated instead of being sort of, just sloughed off and lost. Of course, the pressures are immense to speak not just English, but whatever the other kind of major or dominant languages of particular areas are. And in New York, in some cases, it's actually the pressure to shift to Spanish or Mandarin or Russian that may come first for speakers of indigenous Mexican or Central Asian or, less common Sinitic languages of China. So, there's a massive amount. And of course, this is not just sort of languages are not, as it were, dying natural deaths. This is an atmosphere of pressure and shame that has been, developed and ultimately come through relations of power and manifests in many different ways. In terms of language revitalization and what does it take, we are in some ways, I guess the good news is, and I talk about this in the book, and Lenape is one case, but now there are hundreds, in a kind of golden age of language revitalization. So there is now a massive response that's happening to language loss globally. We're trying to support the parts of it that are happening in cities like New York. Native American tribes in many cases are leading the way. A language like Wampanoag, which was the first language that the Pilgrims encountered in Massachusetts, ceased to be spoken for over 150 years, has now been revived into an extraordinary degree by a Wampanoag woman named Jessie Little Doe Baird and some colleagues there who are creating hundreds of new speakers in those parts of Massachusetts. So, it's a huge uphill battle. I try to kind of show like, what does it take? Technology can play a positive role in that, but it takes just like an extraordinary kind of drive. And again, as part of language justice, I think there should be resources available for this work. And there is a little bit that comes from the federal government for Native American language work, but given the sort of precipice that almost all Native American languages stand at, those that are still spoken, there's much more that should be done. So there is a whole kind of working world of language revitalization. The case of Hebrew is known as one of the extraordinary cases. Hawaiian is another one. Catalan, Welsh, Maori. There are all these kind of cases which have different sort of dimensions that have been pioneered over the last century or so.
Hi. So you mentioned or alluded to some sort of efforts to try to document or like preserve languages through written forms like dictionaries. But you also mentioned that a large majority of these endangered languages are oral. So I'm wondering if there's like pushback from these communities and these types of preservation efforts, and if there are sort of alternative oral methods of preservation.
Thanks. That's really interesting. I think, the reality is primarily oral, but for most language activists, there is interest or desire in pursuing writing, and a lot of effort goes into, coming up with writing systems that will fit the language, and with linguists often, as sort of consultants in terms of how it fits with the sound structure of a language, with sound system. But then the ultimate decision is always up to the community. There are communities where it's a more of an oral focus. The challenge is just that for classes, materials, the internet, the written form is so is so essential to how most people think of preservation these days and of continued use into the future, that in some ways it's hard to get away from. Unfortunately, then a lot of kind of angst can be spent on what the written form will be, and whether by sort of standardizing it as a written form tends to do, you're actually losing a lot of the variety and variation that is inherently there. I think to some extent there can be and there are ways of doing it with a sort of an oral focus, or certainly just with less attention to writing, but there is some kind of inherent tension there where in some ways, do you have to accept some kind of standardization and uniformity and loss of diversity to get it into a form that will be sort of taken up more broadly? And then, unfortunately, in the whole sort of what is a language, what is a dialect kind of battle, a famous kind of line about this: a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. That it has to do with power. A dialect, speakers, if speakers of a given dialect are able to sort of proclaim that their thing is a language, their way of speaking is a language, because they have enough political power, they can do so, and they can then impose through schools and so on. And we didn't even talk about sort of bilingual education and all of that, which is a whole realm of language policy as well that is growing in fascinating ways and has interesting kind of legal connections. It's the other part is that sometimes if you don't have a writing system, you will be considered sort of just a dialect, and a writing system is a sort of an iconic way of showing that you are a distinct language community. So there is an inherent tension there.
Given the purposization of these communities that speak like minority languages and endangered languages, could you speak to more of the process of surveying and mapping and how you kind of like found these different communities?
Thanks. So the Endangered Language Alliance, we've been around since 2010. So there's been time to just grow a wide network of people, and a lot of it has been speakers coming to us. We're getting emails and calls all the time, being like, "Oh, my grandmother speaks this language," or "Oh, I grew up with this such and such language. We have this community in the Bronx or at Staten Island or in Jersey, wherever." And then we also, those of us who are part of it, even trained as linguists, but from different communities, have different ties to different languages and have brought those to bear. So there's, very different processes, the sort of documentation of a language, what's involved in creating a dictionary and like working through, the sound system of a language, the grammar, the syntax, all of that. That's one kind of process. And this work of mapping and sort of showing what there is very much another. So it's really relationships, one relationship leading to another, and understanding, global linguistic geography, where linguistic diversity is concentrated, because it's not evenly concentrated. It's in particular sort of hotspots, which in many ways correspond to and are connected to biodiversity hotspots, which is an important connection. There is this kind of linguistic diversity, biodiversity nexus as well, and there's certain similarities to look at there that we try to tease out. But by understanding, for instance, that in my case, having worked for a long time in the Himalaya on languages there, seeing the formation of a new Himalayan diaspora hub here, and knowing where people were coming from, even having relationships there and people coming here, and sort of, working through sort of the layers of languages. Knowing, for instance, that many Himalayan New Yorkers come from a particular part of Nepal, sort of northernmost section of Nepal, which itself is a place where every valley in some cases has a different language, each of which is now basically represented to some extent in Queens. Languages which were separated by massive mountains are now kind of a few blocks from each other in Jackson Heights. That kind of like just those conversations and years of working with people and kind of asking questions, understanding new migration patterns as they arise, and sort of the history of the city by being here and having a range of relationships here. We haven't even really spoken about the whole situation in the last couple of years with asylum seekers coming to New York and other cities, New York being the biggest, center for this, bringing whole new communities into being, and another massive linguistic challenge, which, we to some extent have been kind of talking through with the city, but, so seeing, growing communities of speakers of Wolof from Senegal and Fulani from Gambia and Senegal and elsewhere, forming in the city, and then if you can to some extent work through other lingua francas like French, but then to really kind of communicate with people in their mother tongue is to get a different kind of experience. So it's really about sort of like networks and digging and this kind of informal census of thousands of conversations through community leaders and conversations, but then also certain things like the hometown associations that I mentioned, which are sort of the bedrock of the immigrant city in many ways, and don't exist in every community, but are very common, like in the Himalayan communities I just mentioned, where every valley has a different language. Every valley, there's also a kind of a hometown association. They call it in Tibetan, they'll be called kiduk. They have different names in different languages, but there'll be a group of people who may or may not have a physical space, but talk about it in the book, in Queens or Brooklyn, who are all from the same area. And so you meet the organization, you meet people, and you sort of see, I think there's a sort of a deeper map of the city, which is based on its institutions. And our map is very much connected to these significant sites, hometown associations, but also mosques, temples, churches, restaurants, residential enclaves, and so on. And the whole pattern of the city's diversity that emerges as well from a linguistic lens, I think, is different from what people think. It's not about an enclave like this neighborhood is all this and all that, but it's actually very much kind of mixed and imbricated and complicated.
All right, with that, I think we're going to wrap. This has been very fascinating for me. I can tell you that like 10% of what we talked about is in the book.
Please take the book. Thanks so much to the Brennan Center, for Tom, and please get in touch. You can find me if you have any questions, any thoughts about the book. I hope you find something in there, and I appreciate your taking the time to listen.